In today's missive, I will be sharing about a beautiful young woman named Diane Olkwitz. Her life was tragically taken from her at the age of 19 years old in the town of Menominee Falls. Officials there said it was the first murder they could recall in this peaceful community, but the case went cold until recently. Diane was murdered on November 3rd, 1966. It would take 57 years to find the killer. This is Cold Cases Solved, the story of Diane Olkwitz. Diane was the classic girl next door. Everyone loved her. She was pretty, smart, and responsible. Her siblings adored her, and being the second eldest of 6 children, they looked up to her. Family and friends describe her as having the greatest sense of humor, delightful, religious, sweet, quiet, sensitive, outgoing, warm, caring, beautiful, generous, loyal, and the perfect friend. She would take everything to church, Patty, her younger sister, said. If she was struggling with something, she'd run up to St. Mary's and she would pray about it. Soon after Diane graduated high school, she met Donald Hurlmeyer, the first serious boyfriend she ever had, and they eventually became engaged. She had everything going for her. She lived in a quaint community for the 60s, right outside Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in a town called Menominee Falls, where people left their doors unlocked and kids played in the streets with no fear at all. 2 months before Diane's death, a 10-year-old girl was found sexually assaulted, stabbed, and beaten to death in Milwaukee. Her younger sister, Debbie, said, "I remember talking to Diane about it, and I remember saying, 'It's so scary that that girl got murdered.' And Diane said, 'Oh, you don't need to worry. We're fine. We live in Menominee Falls.'" Diane worked as a secretary at Kenworth Manufacturing Company, a metal stamping plant. She had been working there for a year and a half on the late shift, from 3:30 in the afternoon to 4:30. The factory workers went home at 3:30, so her job was to stay to be able to answer calls and accept late deliveries. Every day after work, she would pick up her friend, who was also named Diane, Diane Zimmer, who worked nearby, and they would drive home together. One night, Zimmer was waiting for her friend Diane to pick her up as usual, but she was very late. After attempting to call Diane at her work at Kenworth Manufacturing, with no answer, as there were no cell phones at that time, Zimmer decided to take a ride from someone else who offered to take her to Diane's work. When they got to Kenworth Manufacturing, they noticed Diane's car parked in the parking lot. They walked to the front door, but it was locked. They peered through a window and saw that Diane's purse was sitting on her desk and her coat was hung up, but no sign of Diane. They weren't worried at that point. They just figured she was doing something for work and lost track of time. But it was unlike her to not have phoned her friend if she would be late. They decided to go to the building next door because that is where Diane's brother worked. The 3 of them went back to Kenworth just as the supervisor arrived to do some after-hours work. So at 5:20 p.m., the 4 of them made their way inside. And what they saw, they couldn't believe. Just 20 feet from the shipping room door, they found Diane, lying face down, her knit dress pulled up between her legs and off her shoulders, in a pool of her own blood. Let's go back. A month or so prior, Diane's fiance had been drafted into the Army for the Vietnam War and left for basic training at Fort Hood, Texas. Diane missed him terribly, and to fill her nights after work, she would swim and take knitting classes. She also took a part-time job as a hostess at the local Dutchland dairy restaurant. She was scheduled to work the day of November 3rd. That day, before Diane headed out to Kenworth Manufacturing for her first job of the evening, her sister Patty called her to ask to borrow her blue mohair sweater that she loved for a sleepover that night. Diane said of course, and that she would leave it outside her apartment door so she could pick it up. Diane then gets in her car and drives to Kenworth. She walks in, sets her purse on her desk, and hangs her coat by the closet. She says goodbye as the factory workers ended their day, and soon she was the only one left in the building. Sometime around 4, when everyone was gone but before her shift was over, a delivery came from a truck driver who was just there 4 days prior delivering for his company, Claremont Transfer Co. Recognizing him, she went over to let him in. But little did she know the truck driver, Clarence Tappendorf, a 38-year-old married man of 15 years, did not have a delivery that day. It's important to note that there's no video footage, nor is there any testimony, as the killer was deceased by the time they found out who it was. But we can assume, based on the evidence, that once Diane unlocked the door, he came in, got her to a place where no one could see through a window, and started stabbing her over and over, up to 106 times with a 3.5-inch blade. She fought hard though, as there were defensive wounds on her arms and the back of her hands. Tappendorf at some point also broke her nose as well. She had at least 30 stab wounds in her head, neck, and face, and 35 in rows down the sides of her back, where she had been stabbed repeatedly while on her stomach. The stab wounds measured from 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch wide, and from 2 1/4 to 3 1/4 inches deep. Police immediately went to work. They interviewed dozens of friends and acquaintances the same night of the murder, and more than 500 people within the next few weeks. Detectives worked around the clock with no days off, trying to solve the murder of Diane Olkwitz. In the next few days after the murder and no one convicted, sales of large dogs, chain locks, and firearms increased as the neighborhood began to question their safety. 250 people came to pay respects at Diane's funeral at St. Mary's Catholic Church. Her shocked and devastated fiance was also granted leave in order to attend. The police had a few leads and suspects by this time, but they all had alibis. More than 100 pieces of evidence were sent to the FBI in Washington, D.C. for analysis, including fingerprints lifted at the scene and Diane's bloody clothing. But soon, the investigation went cold. The evidence that was sent to the FBI didn't result in a break in the case, and they were forced to move on to other cases. Captain Dan Schramm said, "The case was always on the minds of anybody who worked there." As DNA technology evolved in later years, police kept track of updates in hopes of solving the case. Recently, police finally identified Tappendorf as Olkwitz's killer through forensic investigative genealogy. Police also had a suspicion Tappendorf may be linked to another unsolved murder case that happened 5 years later, where the victim was stabbed over 60 times. When they received the results, they found he was responsible for 2 murders, not just one. A 15-year-old girl named Terry Lee Erdman, who was found in a field behind a department store only a couple miles from where Olkwitz was murdered. Police said this type of DNA technology is relatively new and just started using it in 2019. They mentioned that without it, this case would likely be unsolved to this day. After police identified Tappendorf as Olkwitz's killer through DNA, they went back through the case files and discovered his name among the many that had been acquired during the initial investigation. Tappendorf died in 2008 at the age of 80. He will never be able to answer for his crimes, but we can at least take away his good name by sharing what he did to Diane and Terry Lee all those years ago. There was an obituary when he died that sang his praises, but I want to make sure that everyone knows what a monster he was. Also, if Tappendorf killed those 2 young women, he may be responsible for more. Police said they do not have any leads as of now, but they will be storing this DNA to test any other unsolved similar cases during that period of time. The pain and suffering Diane's loss was to this family was immeasurable. Her fiance, Erlmeyer, was devastated. He went back to basic training, and just a little over a year later, he was sent to South Vietnam as private first class and was killed by a mortar round in the Quang Tinh province. Her sister Debbie said beforehand it was a lot of family get-togethers and a lot of family fun and Sunday meals with relatives. Afterwards, it was just sad. Her sister Patty said growing up having her sister was really special, and not having her around was very difficult. They tried to keep it all together, but it was just never the same. Her friend Diane Zimmer, who found her friend's lifeless body, said it took her 5 years before she would go out at night in the dark. Diane's parents also died young. Her mother Irene died in 1973 of congestive heart failure at the age of 50. Patty said she just gave up. Diane's father, Robert, followed 3 years later, dying of a heart attack at 55. Patty said he didn't show emotion, but they would catch him crying. Her oldest sister, Nancy, died at 58, and Diane's brother, Dennis, who never gave up his search to solve his sister's murder, suffered a debilitating stroke at the age of 50 and died 12 years later. There are only a few remaining family members, but now that they have closure, we hope that they can find some peace in that. We offer our heartfelt condolences to the family and those that were involved. So what do you think? Are there other murders Tappendorf could be guilty of? Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. Stay tuned for next week's podcast. While you're at it, hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you will be notified of every new episode that goes live on Wednesdays. Until next time, XOXO.